The Seeking Eye Life Exploration podcast is and will always be free to access. But if you would like to support my work, please consider joining my Patreon or signing up on YouTube as a channel member. By doing so, you will receive exclusive benefits, including early access to future podcast episodes, access to hosted discussion groups, and access to non-podcast supplementary videos. So click the join button underneath this video to join as a YouTube channel member, or find the link to my Patreon page in the description. Thank you.
The beginning was really when I was about 11. And I mean, I had experiences, not out-of-body experiences, but I had, I guess, what you would call paranormal experiences prior to that age, from probably around 5 years old. But it was 11 that I had a series of brief out-of-body experiences where I found myself around probably half a mile, something like that, from where I lived. So it wasn't the classic scenario that people talk about of being above my body and looking down at myself. It was, I just sort of found myself in a different location. I wasn't asleep. I've never experienced sleep paralysis in my life, not once. Just to sort of, because people always assume all of this stuff. So yeah, I just found myself, I was relaxing on my bed, and then suddenly it was almost like my whole consciousness just shifted and I found myself in another location. I was floating about a foot and a half, something like that, off of the ground in a vertical position, just looking around me and, you know, just as you would be, very surprised, wondering what's going on. And as is common in these experiences, when I had this sort of emotional reaction, like shock, surprise, that kind of destabilizes the experience often. So then I found myself back in my body again. And this happened, I'm not really exactly sure. It was, you know, a long time ago, and memory's fallible, etc. But I think it happened about 3 times in a sequence, like over a few days or months. And then I pretty much didn't know what to make of it. So I put it aside, didn't really know what it was. I'd never heard of astral projection or out-of-body experiences or anything like that. But then I did hear about it, probably in a newspaper or on TV or something like that. I'm not sure where I heard, but I heard the term out-of-body experience, and I thought that's what happened to me. So then I went to a bookshop in central London, trying to find a book on the subject, and I did find a scientific book by Janet Lee Mitchell, who's a parapsychologist, and it was called Out-of-Body Experiences, a Handbook. And I read that, and again, she was quite focused on the veridical elements and the science. She was doing experiments with Ingo Swann. He's better known for remote viewing, but he also did some out-of-body work as well. So I read that. It had a technique in the back of the book on how to induce them, which was based upon just imagining you were floating on clouds. Not really the best technique, but it was all I had at the time. So I read there or in another book that it can take a long time to learn, which is true. And I think anyone who says otherwise is just being dishonest, really. So it's important for people learning to be aware of that. So I set myself probably that I was going to spend about a year, I think, trying to learn it. And after about 6 months, I was getting really disheartened, and I was starting to feel like it's never going to happen. I'd been doing it every single day, you know, systematically for that whole period, and it just hadn't. Nothing really was happening other than I was getting vibrations sometimes and feelings of lifting and things like that, but not a full out-of-body experience. But on this particular day, I kind of had committed to stick with it. So I was kind of going through the motions, I guess, and trying to stick with it. But I felt this sort of feeling of something was happening, but I thought, oh, it's not going to work. I've tried so many times, and
I've been there as well.
yeah.
It's very, yeah,
But
it's very
the
discouraging.
but the interesting thing is, I let go. I wasn't so obsessed with doing it like I had been, because basically I semi given up. So I sort of let go, and I relaxed. Instead of, I had this idea of projection, and that you needed to kind of make it happen and use your willpower. And I had all of this kind of idea in my head, which is probably the opposite of what you should actually do. But that was the impression I'd got from a lot of the books that were out at the time. Um, so instead of that, I let go, and I just sort of relaxed. And that's when it happened. I had this huge jolt of energy. This is not common, but it happened that first time, first time that I consciously induced one. And I had this jolt, felt really powerful, almost like lightning or something like that. But it wasn't nothing painful or uncomfortable or anything like that, but just this very intense energy. And I kind of couldn't focus because this energy sort of consumed me, basically. And then as that dissipated, the next thing I was aware of was I was floating in the air. So this was more like a classic OBE. I was floating in the air above my body, looking down at myself. My body looked sort of grayed out, almost like I was looking at a photograph of myself in black and white, something like that. So I knew it was me, but it didn't feel like it was the real me. The real me felt like the one floating above. I remember I couldn't move very much. I could only rotate, like there was a pole running through my body. So I could just sort of do like a rotation movement. And then the whole room had a kind of bluish green tint to it. That could have been moonlight, but I think it was energy, like related to the experience. That probably lasted a minute or two. And then I went back to my body again. It sort of destabilized, which is very common in the early stages, because you have an emotional reaction. So you've got to try not to do that in the learning process. Easier said than done, but that's the truth. And then I came back to my body, and after that, it felt almost like the floodgates had opened. It became much easier to initiate an experience. So that was how it all began, basically.
Interesting. And I can attest as well with how, especially anxiety, because I've got an anxiety disorder, and I can attest how when you're trying to induce some sort of experience like that, as soon as that anxiety takes hold, it's not letting go, and you can feel your heart race, and suddenly all feeling comes back into your body and you've lost it. So before I ask Krystal if she's got any kind of questions, because I know where her mind is likely. It sounds like it was a dream, which is where my mind would be as well. So before we actually start with that, would you like to briefly describe kind of your strongest experience of a veridical aspect that you were able to gather information accurately and verify?
Well, there's quite a few. Maybe I can start with the first one, because not long after that initial experience. Well, I say not long. It was maybe a year or something like that. I had the first experience that was veridical in some way. I guess at that point I probably also considered it probably some kind of interesting hallucination. I mean, I didn't consider it a dream because I wasn't asleep, and it didn't have any of the qualities of a dream. And since I've had my EEG monitored and things like that, so I know I'm not dreaming. I'm not in REM. I'm not in dream sleep. I'm not asleep at all. But and then there's other research as well, like a Canadian university did some research where they put a young woman who could induce OBEs into an fMRI scanner, and again, she wasn't asleep. She was all different aspects of her brain were active, but she wasn't sleeping or dreaming. So I think.
So yeah. So as you say, as my mind would go to it from a early, if I was just starting with the experiences, my mind would also go to this is going to just be some sort of hallucination, as you say, as I suppose many people would do without that kind of that verification.
Yeah, I mean, we can get really technical. if you want. I mean, I think it is some kind of construct, but then again, so is our conscious experience of reality in general. You know, what we see is not just information coming into the eyes, it's how our brain reconstructs everything. So in that sense, I think there is an element of construct going on, but there is an element of objectivity as well, the same as in objective reality. So anyway, the first experience I had that was veridical in some way was I was going down Bayswater Road in London. I found the experience started at Marble Arch. I just found myself at Marble Arch, which wasn't that far from where I was living at the time. And I was drifting along Bayswater Road, went right the way along it, past like Notting Hill. So it's quite a long distance. I drifted, and then I went to the right, and I went down towards Portobello Road Market, somewhere I'd never been at the time. And as I went down there, I sort of glanced across, and I saw the signs that you have in London with the postcode. So I saw W11. I didn't see the full sign. There's another aspect with OBEs that you tend to have this kind of zooming effect. So you see kind of elements of what's going on. That's also apparent in remote viewing as well, which is interesting. But yeah, so I went along towards Portobello Road Market, and I think it was Lancaster Road I came onto, and then I went into the upper floor of one of the sort of terraced houses there. And this is in probably the early 90s, so you know, people were still using letterhead paper and things like that. So there was a desk laid out with you know, office type paraphernalia, and again I looked at the paper, and I was able to perceive the name of the person. So I had the rough location, the postcode, and the name. So came out of that environment, came back to my body. So the obvious thing was, okay, I can look in the yellow pages. Again, quite old school.
They're going back a few years.
Yeah, so I went to the yellow pages, opened it up, looked up that name, and then found that there was a person by that name in Lancaster Road in West 11, as I'd seen it. So that was the first sort of veridical experience.
Sure. And just for Krystal, your benefit, the Yellow Pages is kind of a business directory where you can find, and a personal directory of everybody that is in a certain area and their contact phone numbers and things like that.
Yeah, we used to have those here in the white pages. We used to get them more in the 90s, yeah.
So had you ever actually been physically to that location before? Where
No, I'd never even been to Portobello Road Market. So I'd definitely not been to that street. And even if I had, I mean, I couldn't have seen the upper floor of that house.
No.
So.
And was it kind of again, very much grasping at straws, but was it any kind of guessable name like Smith, Jones, blah, 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 blah,
No,
that sort of thing? No. Okie dokie. So, Krystal, what do you make of that sort of experience? Because I know, as you say, like me, you're still very skeptical about these experiences and the veridical ability of them being for example, just outside of the mind. What do you make of an experience like that? Any questions you have?
Real quick, am I laggy when I talk?
You're laggy, full stop, but I don't think there's much we can do about that.
So I guess I don't distrust experiences like that. Like I'm sure they are real, and that's not really my issue as much, is like more of knowing what the value of that would be in our life. So like if these experiences are real, like in which they probably are, at least to that person and their consciousness, what is the value of it in our life? And like, what does that tell us about, I guess, how we should be perceiving things or something? because I do believe those kinds of experiences are real, but I just have a hard time wrapping my head around how somebody can have an experience like that and then just continue on in life as we do, like normally, without having it like affect us in some way, and for what reason.
Coming from a working class London background, growing up in a tower block, a council flat, my dad was a butcher and then a dustman, and my mum was a carer, basically. So very ordinary sort of working class environment, no interest in religion or anything spiritual or anything like that. So it did majorly change me. It made me consider that there was more. It made me think about exploring what the nature of our spiritual reality is. It made me see that the interconnection between things, made me think a lot more about compassion and non-violence and things like this. Led me to become vegan, led me to do all kinds of things in my life that maybe I wouldn't have done otherwise, and lead a very, I guess, unconventional life in that sense. So it did have a big impact on me, and I think the experiences are very much how you interpret the meaning and the purpose of them is very much a personal journey, I think. And that's, I think, one of the amazing things about it is to explore that and to see where that journey takes you. I'm not a big person for sort of dogmatic, this is what something means in your life, and this is the truth. Whenever people start saying, oh, we live in a prison reality, or we're only here to learn, or all these different ideological sort of belief systems, that kind of really turns me off, because I'm kind of like, well, I think that's a very limited worldview. There's just so much more potential going on in terms of these experiences and in terms of exploring what you are. I mean, if you are a spirit in some form, which I don't necessarily believe, but if that is the case, then, what better way to explore it than an out-of-body experience? If it is purely materialism, but materialism is bigger than we currently think, that is also a pretty incredible possibility. So I think either way, there's just so much potential there.
I guess from learning about near-death experiences and things of the sort, I kind of have been leaning towards the idea that maybe we're here to learn something. And for me, I feel like I need to like kind of know why I'm here, to like suffer through it in some sense. So do you not believe that we're like here for any real reason other than to experience life?
Well, I think that's a pretty incredible reason. I think life itself is pretty incredible. I think I'm a person who believes in learning as much as we can from an experience, but I think ideas that we've sort of chosen to be here, I think they can be quite problematic, because or that it's something karmic, like that we've been sent here. They can be very problematic, because disabled people, then it's implied that it's their fault in some way, and same with someone who's raped or murdered, or the Holocaust, or whatever.
They've done.
They deserve it, or they've chosen it, which both ways is quite problematic, because I remember seeing, I like William Gilman a lot. I consider him a friend, but I saw him give a talk once where he said, we don't have to worry about the environment because it's all an illusion and it's all a kind of construct anyway. And those kinds of ideas I do find problematic and difficult, when people start to look at the world as purely some kind of educational system or something like that. I think for me, I don't feel there's a strong reason to believe that. And I think that what the experiences seem to show is more that there's a sort of interconnection between everything. And I think the meaning or purpose that you draw from that is very much an individual thing, I think. But if we start to see things in a more interconnected way, then that leads to the opposite outcome, that we start to show more compassion to other people. We start to consider, we do care about things because we don't see the natural world as this other thing that we can just exploit, or, you know, other people or other species or whatever. So, and that's something that I've tangibly seen in OBEs. Go on. So.
Yeah, I actually do agree with you on that front. I have also struggled with the ideas that, you know, we chose it or here to learn like a specific thing. Like I do agree that that kind of teeters on like unbelievable for me. And, you know, I don't necessarily think that we do deserve or have picked to be here. Because I guess in some sense that would be like fatalistic, and I don't really find myself to like fatalism in general. And then if you like look at Friedrich Nietzsche or somebody else who didn't like Christianity, you know, it's kind of going back to the same thing. Like in some sense, Christians are like nihilistic because they don't appreciate this earth or take care of it or enjoy their experience here because they're so focused on what's to come. And so that makes them, you know, mindless in some sense while they're here because they have some better goal. And so I think from that perspective, like learning to love or like be here to learn can have the same effect. I think in the sense that you're not really focusing on your experience here. You're like, what can I do to make this school of life? And how can I ace it so that when I get to where I'm going, it's better? I don't really think of it that way either. It's kind of like somewhere in between, like how you see things and that perspective, because I do believe that like we are all connected, and because we're all connected, that like should make us want to treat each other better because we're all essentially one. And to me, that would give life meaning if you could like prove that, I guess. But
so kind of, yeah, so like mistreating others is equally as harmful as, or is effectively mistreating yourself if you're all connected.
Right.
So I mean, just to add a question onto that, along those lines, for me, I struggle to find reason in the belief that the death of the physical body is kind of the annihilation of us, our personal memories, etc. Because then, to me, that raises the moralistic question of, well, why bother in the first place?
Yeah, that's my
because ultimately we're going to die, and fine, our memories will live on in our children, etc. But you know, at the end, the universe is going to dissolve in the great crunch or whatever it's called, and everything that's ever happened in reality will just be forgotten. So it doesn't matter if you're Mother Teresa or Hitler. Ultimately, everything, when the sun expands, that's it, game over. So I always struggle with that philosophy that, you know, life is the meaning in and of itself because it's temporary. So what do you think about, I suppose, the general idea of death through your experiences with out of body and those kind of connotations?
But I mean, with the temporary thing, I think in many ways that makes it more important to make it as much as possible. You know, I mean, to me, it seems like the ultimate outcome of reality probably is the physical. I see, you know, a lot of people see that the other way around. But I kind of wonder if these other levels, if they are objectively real, are kind of, you know, the outcome of those levels is the physical. We tend to, I don't know, there tends to be an anti-physical attitude in a lot of spiritual discussion, be that from an Eastern perspective or a Western perspective. But well, I mean, Christianity is Middle Eastern anyway, so it's sort of Eastern anyway. But yeah, there's this whole kind of idea that the physical is somehow bad, and that's exaggerated even more in certain philosophies and stuff. And I find that kind of just unhelpful and unnecessary as a kind of way of looking at things. I think we have choice, and we can put the purpose into the choices that we make in our lives. You know, we can decide what the purpose is, and I think just because it's going to end or not going to exist forever or whatever, I don't think that demeans it in any way. I think that just makes it even more precious in a sense. You know, ephemeral things can be the most beautiful things in many ways. It's yeah, like the changing of the seasons, or seeing something momentarily, like the Northern Lights or something like that. It's hard to capture those things, and I think that's precisely what makes them beautiful and incredible. And I think our own existence can be like that too.
Indeed, and I get that point, and many people hold it. But my issue with that is, again, when it comes to, once the sun runs out of whatever it is, hydrogen to fuse, or however it works, I don't know. But it's going to expand and swallow up the Earth, and then for me, ephemeral or otherwise, or if it is ephemeral, then to me it's, what was the point in any of it? Because there's no one around to benefit or remember or anything. It just would seem like a bit of a joke to me, life in that regard.
I guess you'd have to unpack what you mean by point. Like, how does something, how would something have a point or a value in your understanding then?
I guess,
Well,
go ahead.
I mean, sorry, I was just going to say, we go through life, we love, we hate, we suffer, as you mentioned earlier, we suffer grief considerably. And generally, I find life at the moment to be a lot more kind of negative than positive. Just for me, my mental health and all that isn't good. And so to me, if I was to live all this, lose people I love and really suffer and experience joy at the same time, ultimately, if all that just comes to an end and is as if it never took place in the first place, then would I rather just not have been born and live in oblivion, never have to go through the suffering, although you do, of course, miss the positives as well. But
well,
that probably doesn't even answer your question.
Well, I guess though that, I mean, that would be a choice thing again, wouldn't it? It would be like, whether you attach any value to existing is kind of a hard question. I guess that is like nihilism versus sort of non-nihilism in that kind of sense. But I think for me, that existence does have a value and does have a kind of ultimate importance, in a sense, because it's all we can know, it's all we've ever known, in a sense. So I think that in itself is the core of its value. Like, to me, the fact that it ends doesn't, I don't think that negates its value. I don't sort of resonate with that idea. But anyway, I think that we are kind of on the same page. I don't think that it is ending necessarily anyway. I do think that there is a bigger picture. I mean, it might be that consciousness is fundamental to reality. That might be the case. I don't know, but there is evidence suggesting that. Then, I mean, at the very least, you have to say that the laws of nature allow for consciousness to exist, because it does exist. So there has to be something in the structure of reality that allows for life and for consciousness to arise. So there's no reason to believe that couldn't happen in many forms, in many places, etc. So, but I do.
And I think it's, sorry, I was going to say, I think it is always difficult to argue the meaning of something, because it is very inherent to the individual themselves and their own mindset. So there is no right or wrong answer,
Yeah.
I know where you're coming from as well, Graham, with the whole choice thing, and just kind of like choosing to see things a certain way. But I also kind of see things sort of like there. And I think that's kind of why we connected, is because of how similar our worldviews were. But it's, like, if I do believe that there's meaning, even if it's just consciousness. So, and it sounds like you do as well. So in some sense, are you saying that, like, even if we don't remember our experiences in this life and all the meaning in it, that it still somehow exists anyway, because we're all connected, and so are all of the experiences? Or do you think that, like, they're kind of, you experience life and it just kind of goes into a void, to, just like into an abyss of nothingness?
Well, after death, you mean?
Yeah. But I mean, if you think we're all connected in some sense, would that mean, do you think that would mean that everybody's experiences would somehow just be added to, like, the great bowl of just consciousness, where we're all kind of
I
you
do
know,
think that,
connected.
but it's not just that I think we are connected. I think everything, the nature of
I
reality
agree.
is
Yeah.
connected. So, and I'm saying that from the experiences I've had in OBEs where I've literally experienced kind of interconnected consciousness. I've had experiences where I've felt like I was in like a million minds at once, or these kind of transcendent type experiences I've had. But then also experiences of nature, for example, just like I had an experience where I looked at a flower and I suddenly felt the entire kind of life cycle of that plant. Had the same thing with a small animal where I literally kind of felt like I experienced its entire life cycle through the out of body experience. So it was like that consciousness was interconnected, and I was experiencing that directly. So that's kind of what led me to that way of thinking. And then when I look at more scientific understandings, like I've been involved with quite a lot of parapsychology, and I think many of the models within parapsychology for how psychic abilities might work tend to be something like an extended mind, like Dean Radin and Rupert Sheldrake, for example, put forward, or some kind of entangled consciousness, like Sir Roger Penrose puts forward, or Brian Josephson, who won the Nobel Prize for Physics. These people are putting forward more of that it's some kind of quantum entanglement is going on. So I think there's lots of models within science that are similar in a sense to what I'm talking about, or what I experienced in the OBEs. There's this idea of an extended mind or an interconnected mind. And I think that for me feels like the most likely, or the best fit for what these experiences are and what we currently know. And in terms of after death, I think that there's probably a continuation of that a little bit. The analogy I often use is like a computer connected to the internet. If the computer is broken, the data in that computer will cease to be, but there's still the data that was connected, that was uploaded, if you like.
So kind of like a cloud system.
Yeah.
So
I
would that,
almost
sorry,
go
would
on.
that include our kind of individuality, our individual personality and beliefs and memories, etc., as well, being uploaded to that cloud, or would it just be?
I think
stored
so, but
locally?
that's somewhat of an open question. I'm not a person who claims to have all the answers with these things. I think I can relay what has happened from my experiences and what I've looked at in the science, but my own attitude is a scientific one, in the sense that I apply the scientific method. I try to explore and see what the data is, see what the experience shows, and then see what we can learn from that. And I think there's still a long way to go with out of body experiences, because a lot of these more new age ideas about astral bodies and silver cords and all this kind of stuff holds the area back, because pretty much no one else that I'm aware of is really addressing what's happening directly in terms of the details of the experience and the science and all of that kind of thing. So I think we need more of that.
I was just going to kind of move to the next subject, so I'll introduce it. Then you ask your question, Krystal. So I was just going to say, the common standard scientific model of consciousness is that it's generated by the brain, and that all of this stuff is either impossible or faulty statistics or poorly performed experiments. So I was just going to say, or ask what your opinion is on that idea, and also what are some of the experiments that you've taken part in, and what's the data been?
Yeah, I'll try to make this a quick one since we're kind of want to move on to other things. But when you're talking about science and just like answers, I was thinking about that in relation to so Darren knows this, but I'm pretty interested in personality theory, and I think for different personality types, I kind of feel like we need different answers to some extent. Like I don't feel like there's a one answer fits all for everybody.
I agree.
Yeah, so I feel like for certain people, Darren and I are both like what they call like an INFP, if you want to use that Myers-Briggs model. And for us, we need meaning. And so like to make life feel meaningful, we look for the meaning in everything. And so I feel like naturally that's going to be the question that we ask, and that's the answer that we need. But just looking at your face, you're so much like, I have a friend named Sarah, and she's an INTJ. I don't know if you know Myers-Briggs, but I would bet you that you're an INTJ, just like the way you carry yourself, the way you look and think. And she has very similar thoughts to you, as far as like, she's not afraid of just becoming the dirt. That to her is like a beautiful thing. And so I guess my question in relation to all this is, if our personalities are kind of in some sense different because of biology, which, is in essence science, like head shapes they're realizing can have something to do with personality theory and your personality type. If there are different answers that people kind of need, I've seen this in near-death experiences too, but it kind of seems like those answers that they find in like near-death experiences or out-of-body experiences are kind of like what that person needs on an individual level. So would you find that to be true at all?
Well, for sure, yeah. I mean, there's obviously one of my frustrations in many ways with this area is that every teacher you see out there is kind of claiming this is how it is, and they can be completely contradictory. So I think that's what led me to kind of take a step back from that and try to say, okay, what can we do in terms of the science? Because I started off in like my first teacher when I was like 14. I worked with this guy called Douglas Baker, and I used to basically work with him, sell books and things at his events, and he would give me insight and teach and stuff outside of that. And he was very much coming from a Alice Bailey sort of theosophical kind of angle. And I realized early on that didn't sort of make sense to me, and it didn't match up with my experiences. And then later on, I kind of encountered other ideas, like, Robert Monroe's ideas, or, and then as you go through, and then people like Robert Bruce, and he's very sort of demons and stuff, all these things going on.
Esoteric stuff.
Yeah, and I kind of realized that, well, I'm not experiencing that, and I don't really see any strong evidence to buy into that. So I realized that I needed to take sort of a different approach. So that was when I started exploring more of the science on the personality type side of things. I've done that test twice. I think I was an NFAP the first time I did it.
You were a what? An empath.
No, NFAP, ENFP.
ENFP.
And then the second time I did it, I was the kind of wizard guy. I can't remember which.
INFJ or INTJ?
Yeah, something like that.
Probably really hard for you to take a test like that after you've had certain experiences, because I think the more you develop as a person, the more inaccurate that test is going to be, because as you age and have experiences and get wisdom, you're not gonna see yourself the way you originally started, like in your early 20s or whatever, or for you maybe sooner, because you seem to be pretty mature. So
yeah, so I guess in terms of like, I do think you're totally right about different personality types and what people need. I guess I'm trying to work out what might really be going on, though. I guess it's not so important to me. Maybe I'm not trying to answer questions for people. Maybe I'm trying to encourage people to ask those questions and explore those things themselves. Mm-hmm. I know people would rather I answered their questions. That's definitely better for marketing and things like that. But I'm trying to keep the integrity of this work and really try to encourage people to maybe have the experiences, explore those ideas, but try and do it in a way that they do use a degree of skepticism, and they do question even their own experiences. I try to do that even with my own experiences, especially things on other levels. That's why I generally focus on the more this reality, not because I don't have experiences on other levels. I do. Actually, one powerful veridical experience I had was kind of like a shared death experience, where I saw all of these people who I had obviously recently passed, and they were in this cloud-like, very stereotypically sort of heavenly like environment, clouds, no up, down, left, right. It was all just this misty cloud like environment. And there was about 150 people was what I wrote in my diary. It turned out I think it was 141, so it was pretty close. And they were like having life reviews, they were confused, they were having all these memories and things, and I could see their memories and their sort of life reviews. It was almost like they're, you know, like a little screen around their heads almost. And I was kind of sharing in this and seeing one guy in particular I remember very vividly, like he seemed to be having a struggle with his father, and he was going through this sort of emotional turmoil, kind of reliving some of the things with his father. And then there was a woman who sort of just seemed to pass through the process very quickly. So I remember all of these sort of elements in it. But then I found out a few hours later that there'd been a plane crash exactly at the time that I'd had the out-of-body experience. And the plane crash, people on it were mainly Russian, Ukrainian descent, which matched with what I'd seen in the out-of-body experience as well. Their appearance. They were workers, so they were very rugged looking and kind of, you know, they were all outside kind of workers and stuff. So that was an example of something that happened on another level, but or what seemed to be another level, but had verification on this level as well. So, you know, those kind of things can be interesting, but I guess in general, things on other levels, I always put a question mark over them, because it's kind of like, well, how can I really know whether that was not just something completely subjective to me, etc.
So to move on then, what are your thoughts on the standard model that the brain produces consciousness, as is also believed by a guy called Mikhail Raduga, who's a well-known out-of-body experiencer who's also a stringent materialist. What are your thoughts on that kind of viewpoint? And what was the other question that I added to that?
About the science, I think.
And the what were some of the experiments that you've taken place in? Because parapsychology is often seen as faulty science.
Yeah, unjustifiably, I think, you know, because there's actually been research done looking at how solid the controls are and all of that kind of thing with him, and they actually found that the controls and the likelihood of reporting false, like negative outcomes and things like that, was higher in parapsychology than in mainstream science. So there's that. But yeah, in terms of, I don't think it's problematic to me if consciousness, I don't know whether consciousness is fundamental or whether it arises from the brain, but it doesn't hugely matter to me. I have a model I call the mass model, which basically allows for both possibilities. So like at the moment, I don't think the evidence is conclusive one way or the other. I think it could even be a bit of both, which we don't usually entertain as a possibility, but I do think that a bit like I was saying with the computer and the cloud, both of those things can exist. Both levels can exist at the same time, and maybe part of the process is the computer or the brain, and part of the process is the cloud or the extended nature of things. So I think it could be a mixture, but I tend to think that I tend to lean probably more towards it arises from the brain, but like I say, but then it's extended beyond the brain. It's a bigger, you know, it's bigger than just the brain. And like I said, within the nature of reality, I think there is the structures to allow for that extension beyond the brain. So that would mean that consciousness is sort of wider than just the individuals. So in a sense, the outcome is the same. It doesn't hugely matter whether it arises from an individual, whether it's up, bottom up or top down. I don't think changes the outcome that much, really, unless you're invested in the idea of a creator God or something like that. Which, yeah, at this point, I don't believe that. I haven't seen anything to convince me of that. Okay, so the science.
Oh, right. Yeah.
What have I taken part in? So I guess it came from actually talking to skeptics, that whole thing, because they were kind of like, well, if these things are real, why don't you get involved with science? And I was kind of like, well, that's actually a good point. So about 2008, I got in touch with Rupert Sheldrake. That was the sort of first step I made, and had some meetings with him. And he suggested me actually helping him organize some research. So I started off with telephone telepathy experiments, and I arranged and took part in a range of experiments looking at telepathy. And we got statistically significant results. Then I took part in his precognition experiment, which he said I got the highest score he'd ever got in a single experiment. So that was precognition with him, and I continued to be involved in different things that he was doing. Then I took a trip over to the US, and I met Dean Radin. I gave a talk at the Institute of Noetic Sciences, and I got involved with his micro PK experiments. So I was in a kind of steel box. It's like that he's got there. It's a Faraday cage basically, but it's a steel enclosed room. So there's no way any devices can be used or anything like that, because it's cuts out all of that kind of thing. And they sort of wire you up, and you sit in there, and they had an interferometer running, which is basically like the double slit experiment. It fires photons. So the experiment was to try and send your consciousness to the interferometer and try to affect the collapse of the wave function, try to kind of influence the interferometer in a psychic way. And so you're in the room, you try to do this, and it's all monitored and all the rest of it. And again, it was in the predicted direction, so we got a positive result in that. He's replicated that study multiple times, and so have other institutions. So again, there's like good evidence within that. I think Dean's process is extremely tight. He uses computerized systems, so there's no sort of possibility for anyone sort of tampering with anything. Same with Rupert Sheldrake, actually. The telephone telepathy experiments were all run by an automatic system on a computer, and Rupert's not very technically skilled, so there's no way he's sort of tampering with it. He can use Word. That's sort of about as far as I've seen him go with technology.
So just
then.
Sorry, just briefly to touch on that, because one of the common arguments against that kind of experiment is that the effect size, although it's statistically significant, the effect size is so small that most people would consider it, well, why would we pay attention to that? It's such a small effect.
Well, I think that's ignorance, because if you took that attitude, you would say, why would we pay attention to most pharmaceutical drugs? And the classic one that's used as an example is aspirin. The effect size for psi is way above that of aspirin, so you'd have to kind of deny that aspirin works, essentially.
Aspirin in terms of its effect on
as a drug, how it works,
right, on its efficacy, right.
So it gets into, I mean, Dean Radin, like his figure was like 29 quintillion to 1 against chance of those results being being replicated by just chance events, kind of thing.
And
so
standard p-value is what, 0.05, which is
5 I mean, or 4. Yeah, I mean, it's but it's way below that in terms of the research we're doing. I mean, it's but there are some studies that show more macro effects as well. There was a study at Edinburgh, for example, where they had a couple who meditate on each other regularly, and they divided the two people up, I forget whether it was the guy or the woman, but one of them went into a fMRI scanner and the other one was in a completely different location. And they did a really interesting experiment. They took a bright light and shone it into the eyes of one of them, and the one that was in the fMRI scanner, their brain lit up as if a light had been shone in their eyes. So you've got, that's quite a macro level effect. So I think it depends what kind of research and what type of psi effect we're talking about. Again, with Ganzfeld, if you control for people who are like musicians, creative types, that kind of thing, then again, the effect size goes up much more. The standard effect size is maybe it's about 8% above what would be expected by chance. So you often get about 33%, and the chance level would be 25%. But that is quite significant. But that's an average. That's using undergraduate students who have no history of these kinds of things. With most research, they just take people off of the street pretty much and put them into the Ganzfeld or different kinds of experiments, and that's kind of the result. But what they found over time is if you do these controls for particular types of personality traits, like being a musician, creative, those kinds of things, then people tend to do much better. Then the next research I got involved with was actually remote viewing based. So I used OBE and remote viewing, and it was a 14-week study with the Rhine Research Center, who I still work with. I educate, I do different stuff with the Rhine, and have been involved with them since 2014. So this was a 14-week study. So we had blind targets that they set up in the US, and I was in Estonia, living in Estonia at the time. So I had to try and perceive these remote targets. As you would expect, some were misses, some were hits, but again, statistically significant, some amazing hits. And actually, interestingly, the OBE ones were the ones that were the best hits. So that was another example of research I've done, and continue to be involved with what they're doing. So again, and I think within remote viewing, although again, people are not 100% all the time, no one is in this field. Anyone who claims they can be 100% are again dishonest. But I think that the thing is, when you look at it over and over again, and some of the real incredible experiences and hits, and then it becomes very hard to sort of deny that. Even in my witnessed precognitive experience of Soho, it wasn't a controlled experience, but it was witnessed by multiple people, and again, like all of the details matched up with the actual event. So
I remember we talked about that last time, the bombing.
Yeah.
So just before Krystal jumps in, if you don't mind, another point on the experimentation. There's kind of the general idea among those who probably are not parapsychologists is that, if these out-of-body experiences are real and we can come out of our body and perceive things, then why has nobody done it under controlled conditions? It would be very easy, put up a number on a shelf, have someone come out of their body repeatedly and do it. Or, as I always mention, why didn't they win the Randy challenge?
Oh God, I can address both of those. Yeah. Well, first off, there have been some experiments that did that, or that were along those lines. The most recent is Patrizio Tresoldi's research in Italy. I've worked with him as well and written a paper with him, for example. He's done experiments with multiple participants where there have been targets and they've come out of body and perceived the targets. It's not 100%, but it's, again, over 65% plus, so the thing with perceiving things out of body is it needs to be a peak experience. The problem is not every experience is going to be in the veridical category. I tend to focus on what I call the cerulean experiences, which are these sort of blue-gray blue-green sort of type experiences that I've had, which the Soho one was. The Bayswater Road example I gave, that one was as well. And then another type of veridical experience I have is, I call it the crystalline state. And it's kind of looks like a summer's day, the coloring. So the visual perception is very important in those experiences. It's got this kind of yellow and green sort of like a vibrant summer's day kind of thing. And that type of experience can be veridical as well. So the other experience that I've published online that was witnessed by my former partner, the church experience, so that one was the crystalline state, not the cerulean state. But again, I have veridical experiences in that one. So that's another example that was sort of witnessed and verified. So I think what needs to be done is people need to pay more attention to what the characteristics are of the experiences that are very veridical and very objective, and try to reproduce those particular elements, because it is usually just assumed that vision is exactly the same as physical vision, that every experience is completely controllable and everything that happens is identical and that kind of thing. And I think that's not really the nature of the experience. I think it does require these sort of peak experiences, which is why I've sort of focused on trying to do it in the lab, but also being aware that is required. Like Alex Tannis is another person who did laboratory experiments and got some really impressive hits in his research as well. And again, it seemed to work the best when he didn't experience a second body. So there were characteristics of when he was most accurate and when he was able to perceive. So when he experienced a traveling consciousness, he would be more accurate. If he experienced some kind of replica him, which what he called Alex 2, if he experienced that, he would generally be not as accurate. So there's these things that need to be sort of taken into consideration. Then going to the sort of whole number thing, people very rarely see text and numbers. Like in my experience, the same way I saw only fragments of it, like with the sign, I only saw the W11, I didn't see the whole thing, or just seeing the person's name, I didn't see the whole thing. So it tends to be this kind of zooming effect takes place with text. But what I've noticed is in near-death experience research, what people tend to see is small three-dimensional objects, not text. So I've kind of advocated for new experiments to involve small three-dimensional objects, because I think that's what people are actually seeing most commonly in OBEs and NDEs, but definitely in NDEs. I can't think really of an NDE where they saw text. It's like the trainer on the ledge.
Yeah. There is one that I think of where someone came out of their body and saw a 12-digit
oh yeah, that one, yeah,
serial number, but that's the only one I can really think about.
Yeah, that's very unusual and quite impressive that they even remembered a 12-digit serial number, which is the other thing. You know, the Aware project tried to base things on this, but I contacted Sam Parnier and asked him to send me examples of the targets they were using, and he sent me a picture of a newspaper cutting, and which just made me think, you know. And I included it in Consciousness Beyond the Body, the kind of group book that I contributed to. In there, there's a picture of the image he sent me, and it's just a cutting from the Times. And I just thought, well, why is someone in an out-of-body experience, while they're having a cardiac arrest and they can see their body, why are they going to care about a cutting from the Times, you know, that's stuck above a, you know? So I think sometimes it's also the design of the experiment, the way things have been done so far has been very poor. And then people also tend to forget that there's not really anyone funding this kind of stuff, and there's not really any researchers doing the research. So the idea that you can just, it's, you know, just do this experiment, it's just, there aren't people out there doing it. And, you know, scientists need funding to do these things properly. So there's that factor as well. So, and finally, James Randi. So, me and Alex Sakiris from the Skeptico podcast actually got in touch with Randy and tried to arrange to do the Randy challenge. And it was kind of like all the sort of caveats and all the kind of issues with what you need to do to qualify started to come out. So the first thing was you had to do the test twice. The first test was, in their opinion, was a preliminary test just to show that you had some kind of ability. So the money wasn't at risk. So you had to do this preliminary test, which was whether they let you go on to the next test was up to them. And he blankly refused to have an independent judge or an independent scientist doing the experiment, like someone independent from the James Randi Educational Foundation. Not that they do anything educational, but yeah. So anyway, we had a back and forward with him like over quite a period of time, and he just basically wouldn't cooperate. He wouldn't agree to anything that would make the test fair, and would put it within the criteria of a normal scientific experiment. He argued that he was allowed to expect a higher level than in any other form of science because it was his money at risk kind of thing. So basically, I don't think Randy was ever honest about those kind of things. It was just a publicity stunt, really. And he was shown to lie about multiple scenarios. I mean, like the Rupert Sheldrake experiments with dogs, where dogs, were being aware of their owners returning, and Rupert set all those experiments up, and James Randi publicly in a magazine article, he said that he replicated this research and that it didn't work and that there was no evidence, etc. And so Rupert Sheldrake approached him about this and said, can you send me your data? I'd love to see it. And Randy was kind of like, oh, it was lost in a flood. And then Rupert said, well, maybe put me in touch with the owners and the dogs then, the people who you'd used in the experiment. Oh, I've lost their contact details. This was the kind of response. So I think he was a very problematic character who was more interested in his agenda to dismiss this entire field than he was in being scientific and precise. And it's important to remember he wasn't a scientist. He never did any science. He was a stage magician, and his education is very unknown as well, because he gave contradictory stories about his education as well. Like in one story, he said he was such a genius that he left school really early because he was so incredible, and then in another story he said something completely different. So this is the problem with Randy. He did do some good though. He did like the Peter Popoff case and things like that, but in general I don't know why so many scientists sort of celebrate him, because if you really look at his life and what he did, there was a lot of question marks over it as well.
I find that pretty interesting, because I'm also like a little skeptical of statistics, not because I don't trust science and not because I think I know better, but it seems like most of the statistics are done for like one of two reasons. One, I think maybe just out of general curiosity, like which way is it going to go? And then the other one where it seems like a lot of the times when there's a statistic, there's like a theory behind it that initiated the desire to do like the test. And I feel like they're trying to prove something that they already believe to be true, and they think that if they like back it with statistics, it'll make it more believable. And I don't know if that's how it is or not, but I feel like in some scenarios, especially like you said, depending on who's funding it, like if a pharmaceutical company is saying like this is statistically proven to like cure XYZ, they probably had that theory that they wanted, that it was true to begin with, and they wanted to push it. And like, what a better way than to say that it's statistically proven. I'm not saying all statistics are like that, but I often think about something I read in Carl Jung about how like, you know, you can, I think it was like 34 grams. So like you can go to the beach and look for seashells and try to find one that is 34 grams, because apparently that's the average weight of a seashell statistically, but you're not really going, it's going to be really hard to find a seashell that weighs exactly 34 grams, despite being this statistical average. And so I kind of take statistics in some sense with a grain of salt, because there's always like an objective and there's always an angle. And so it's not all inclusive. And I think it's really hard to be, you know, with statistics.
That's true, but I think science is a bit different in how it sort of approaches things with that. I mean, when you're looking at something like is psi real, is a psychic experience real, if you just based it on sort of one experience, that would never be valid scientifically. So you have to use statistics, you have to look at many different cases, and you will have hits and misses. So the only way to analyze that is to kind of see if there's a statistical effect size. But then on top of that, the difference with science is it will be peer reviewed. So there will be other scientists who will come in and try to rip it apart and find errors in the way the statistics have been done or the way the experiments have been done. So there's that factor. Then there's kind of conflicts of interest and things like that, which need to be admitted to by those involved, and if they're not, they'll usually get found out and it will usually come out. So in terms of pharmaceutical science, there is often paid research that's kind of leaning in a particular way to get something passed, but usually eventually that comes out and the scientists will see that because they're analyzing how the experiment was done and they're reviewing it, and if something hasn't been peer reviewed, it generally won't get taken seriously in the way that another piece of research might be. So I think with science, it's different to a sort of general statistic. It's not sort of like sociology or something like that, where you're just sort of making statements about how society is based on, you know, I don't know, a questionnaire or something. It's when you're looking at like real data where you either had like a positive or a negative or something like that, and you're just collating that data together, then I think that's much more robust and reliable. But having said all that, yes, there's no way you can say 100% with anything. I think all science is open to development and interpretation and reinterpretation.
With science, I think it's a little different because even as Darren and I have talked about before, like with science, they're always trying to disprove something rather than prove it, which makes it, you know, more valid. But you know, like, as you could even, I think even statistics like 1 in 5 women are going to get breast cancer. That statistic is true, but I think it's interesting because you could live in an area where like there's like 10 of you and none of you get it, but it's like 1 in 5. But like, what's that perspective? And then again, like genetics take that into consideration. So I think when you look at things as like a mass, you get different results than if you would like put everything into little categories and then evaluate them. So I think it really just depends on how you're evaluating something and like what your objective is, because I think it's true, but you know,
other factors are in play.
It's also just different. Yeah, it just varies. Or like statistically, if your parents were alcoholics, like your chances of it is say like 80% or something. I don't know. But there are circumstances.
Again, you're talking about social statistics there.
Right.
Like I said, that's a bit of a different category. I think when you're just talking about sort of data, but I think as well with this whole area, we're kind of talking about, I think, a convergence of evidence as well, because you're not just talking about, say, one thing like telepathy. you've got the actual lived experiences that people have, like my experiences and the ones that, you know, experiences I've had that have been witnessed and verified, you know, and they often get, those kinds of things get dismissed as anecdotes or whatever, but in my case they've nearly always been written down and documented at the time they happen. So I think a more accurate description is a case study, because you've literally written it down. You're not relying on memory, you know, all of that information is there. And I've, you know, like with the Soho precognitive experience I had, that was written down within probably an hour, but no more than 2 hours of the experience happening. Basically, the time it took me to leave the place that we did the event and get on a bus and go home, you know, as soon as I got home, I wrote the experience down. So whatever time frame that was basically the time frame. So, you know, so I think when I take that experience, then I take the fact that I've only had positive results in scientific research under controlled conditions, and I've had experiences as well that for myself have verified these things in a way that couldn't happen in another way, as far as I'm concerned. When I put all of that together, and then I look at near-death research, past life memories in children, which I before he died, I was a friend of Erlander Haraldsson, an Icelandic researcher who worked with Ian Stevenson and did research on children who had past life memories. So I've done a deep dive into that kind of research as well and seen really powerful evidence. I've interviewed children directly who've had those kinds of experiences and researched them directly. So when I take all of this together, this convergence of evidence all pointing towards the same thing, it becomes quite irrational in a sense for me to kind of dismiss all of that. It would be kind of crazy to say, okay, you know, I would have to be the most dismissive person there is to kind of conclude there's nothing to it.
That's the thing. Like, you know, I don't want to speak about like statistics or science in a way that claims I really know anything about it or its validity, because I don't know anything about it, like, or how it works really. But I guess just like from my experience as well, like a statistic isn't really good enough for me to like not do something or do something, or, you know, convince myself of anything. Because, you know, even with I'm sure you've heard of it, it's called Reddit. I find that to be more helpful to me when I'm having an issue, whether it's medically or psychologically based, because I find real people's experiences, and, you know, they're not statistics, like they're real people, and they'll comment and say, like, I know what you're going through, this is what helped me. And, you know, they'll give me a whole list of things to try that I wouldn't have found if I just read the research. There was even a medication I was on for a while. It's a neuroepinephrine, and every time I take those medications, they have a really odd and specific side effect. And when I talked to a psychiatrist about it, her dismissal of it was rather offensive, because she said, well, that's really rare, so it can't happen. So, you know, because it's something statistically really rare, they think that it means you're just making it up. And I read on Reddit, and I find lots of people who can relate to this experience, but it's just not the majority. So I kind of try to use statistics as like a guide. It's like, okay, well, it's pointing this way, but like, what does everything in between say?
Sure, but I guess the danger with going by personal experiences and stories and things is that you will generally find contradictory stories and experiences from people. You know, like you know, dietary things, for example. You'll get one person who said, "Oh yeah, I'm on the carnivore diet and I feel fantastic and I'm like the healthiest I've ever been in my life." And then someone else will say, I eat no meat at all and no animal products at all, and I feel the greatest I've ever felt in my life, and blah, blah, blah. You know, so the problem is, so who's right? Who's the correct one there? So that's where you have to look at huge quantities of data, and the bigger the data set, and then do meta-analysis where they take different studies which could have personal biases within those studies, and then correlate them together and see the trend in that research. And that's when you get a more a more realistic or a more accurate picture. Nothing's perfect. There is no perfect option, but that is more perfect than anything else.
Go ahead, Darren. Sorry.
I was just going to say, and just to finish off this subject, so there's one more kind of area I want to talk about. And I don't want to keep you all night, but in terms of the statistics, and a good example of how statistics are attacked, especially and attempted to be falsified in parapsychology, especially, is I'm sure you know, is the case with Daryl Bem.
Mm.
Do you know much about that case? Because I don't, outside of its notoriety.
I think a lot of the criticisms have been unfair in terms of Daryl Bem. I mean, I think what you get is sort of biases in general, you know, in terms of how parapsychology is attacked. And you know, to be quite honest, like I mentioned with the dogs that know that their owners are coming home kind of scenario, you know, often what the parapsychologists say, the skeptics say, sorry, is not actually true. So it can be very tricky, and I felt that a lot of the criticism of the Daryl Bem research was not really valid, and there was a lot of criticism that, oh, it can't be replicated and things like that, but it has been replicated now. And even when some people were saying that at the time, that it couldn't be replicated, it had already been replicated at the time of some of those criticisms. So I think what tends to happen is the skeptics will ignore most of the data. I think the only reason that the Daryl Bem research got, you know, they paid attention to it was because it was in a mainstream journal, and he was a respected scientist. He was someone who had done mainstream work, and he was respected for what he was doing. But I think that ultimately it was more like an outrage response. They were like, how can they publish something that suggests that precognition could be real, you know, and there could be this retro effect and all of this kind of stuff? Because he kind of reversed a psychology experiment, was as I recall it. I attended a lecture he gave on it, and he'd taken a standard psychology test, and he reversed it to see if people could basically have, I think it was they would have a memory even though they hadn't yet seen the outcome. I think that was it. It was quite a while ago now, but roughly that was how I remember it being. But yeah, I think I remember reading the criticisms of it and feeling it wasn't that great. If you look at some of the responses to it that Ben made and others made, I think it was a very strong case that he made.
So moving on to the last topic then, which is mainly kind of around the techniques of out-of-body experience, how one can achieve or strive to achieve it. As I mentioned earlier, me and Krystal are using the Monroe tapes because we've both got those. And Krystal, you had a few questions for Graham regarding your own kind of personal situation and what may or may not affect it.
Yeah. You mentioned just a little while ago about your visual, you know, your mental visualization being really important. And I was wondering, do you think you can achieve an out-of-body experience in the same way without being able to mentally visualize? Because that's something I can't do. It's called aphantasia or aphantasia. Basically, just like close your eyes, it's pitch black, you know. So I was curious what your thoughts were.
Yeah, I think you can. I mean, I wrote my second book, Navigating the Out-of-Body Experience, the one that's the practical one. I wrote it in a way to cater to that kind of scenario because in my teaching work, I have encountered people before who can't visualize and things like that. So I realized quite early on in my work that people are different, and a one-size-fits-all approach just doesn't work. So yeah, there are more. It's got a questionnaire in there, which is designed to work out whether you're more a physical person, more analytical person, more auditory person. You know, like there's different sort of categories of how you might be, and then there's people who tend to be more like waking. They're better at. They have lots of, say, paranormal experience in a waking state, like me. That's always how I've done things. I am more of a visionary waking state type person. And then there are people who are better at kind of lucid dreaming and things like that. So I've got the two categories of whether you're a waking or a dreaming type person, and then I've got then underneath that the different categories of whether you are more auditory or physical or whatever. So yeah, you can use methodologies that aim towards that. What I would say that the number one mistake people tend to make, I think, is focusing too much on techniques, really. The key to out-of-body experiences, the reason why one person will do a technique and get nowhere and another person will do the same technique and be really successful, is, I think, because of the pre-state. You need to be in the right depth of trance state or right state of kind of physical shutdown, mental alertness, in a kind of liminal state. You need to be in that right balance between those two things in order for the experience to unfold. So the actual technique part, the actual sort of exit part or whatever, can be very, very simple, and usually simple is better. But if those other factors are not in place, if that pre-state, that depth of state is not there, then that will basically hinder the whole process. So as far with Monroe, I mean, I know that he does sort of do guided meditations on the tracks and things like that, but there is also a very auditory based system. I personally found hemisync and the kind of vocal aspect of it distracting. So with my own technology, the infraliminal technology that uses infrasound and subliminals, so it's a different technology to binaural beats. With that, I didn't put any vocalization on it. It's or not that you can hear anyway. So it's mainly working with very, very low level frequencies, because I found that infrasound can have an impact, and that comes from science as well, that there's been research showing that where places have infrasound naturally, people will often have mystical experiences and unusual experiences. And so I think infrasound, as well as electromagnetic fields, can facilitate going into altered states. So I worked with those technologies to get to the vibrational state, and the vibrational state is basically the pre-state that you need in most cases to launch the out-of-body experience. Some people will have a void state, and some people will have auditory things like buzzing or voices or things like that. So you need to have that sort of pre-state in place. And if I had advice, I would say focus on getting that pre-state down.
So do you foresee any kind of any issues between using yours alongside the Monroe technology?
Not necessarily, no. I haven't ever compared, or and I haven't done the Monroe course or anything, so I don't know the details of everything. I have a basic knowledge of it, as I've experimented with binaural beats and hemisync many years ago, but I haven't done like their formal gateway experience or anything like that. So I don't think there would be any necessary clash. It's just I think it's just the approach you sort of want to take. Like I said, I tend to focus more on what's going to work best for the individual rather than the sort of one size fits all thing. So my gut instinct with that would be like, well, that might or it might not be the right approach for you. So I would consider what is likely to be the right approach based on what you are, how you are as a person. If you are more physical and that kind of thing, then you should use, like for example, my G technique that I use a lot is a very physical technique and uses breathing processes and things. And then I've got more visual techniques, and then I've got more like auditory things, and then also more analytical meditational type things as well for people who are more in their heads kind of, so yeah. So I think the key is to think about how you are as an individual and what's going to be most conducive to you as an individual. I can give myself as an example. Like if I'd come across these approaches that focus on sleep paralysis, I probably never would have got anywhere, because I've never experienced it, never, in my attempts to induce it, to experiment with it, never managed to get anywhere with it. You know, I'm just not in that sleep sort of dream category. And I think many other authors in this area are similar. You know, I think William Bjorman doesn't use sleep and dream. I don't think Robert Bruce does either. You know, I think Robert Peterson, I think, doesn't either. And, you know, I think many of the people in this sort of field are not using those kind of techniques. So but then some people are and find it very effective. So again, it just comes down to analyzing yourself. I think that's really the key.
Sure. Okay. Well, any final questions, Krystal?
I don't think so. Just wanted to say thanks for being willing to chat with us. And I really like that you have that personal approach. Because for me, if I did an exercise or something, and it just wasn't working, I would assume that, you know, I just can't do it or something I'm doing wrong. But I think having that perspective that, you know, you kind of have to custom tailor experiences to people's personal, you know, minds. I think that's really cool. So,
but also it's important to stick with it, I would say, and have the consistency, because like I mentioned with myself, I spent 6 months and wasn't, you know, felt like I wasn't getting anywhere. I felt kind of disheartened with the whole process, but eventually it did work. I think a lot of it is to do with it getting the message to your unconscious mind. And if you know, as I'm sure you're aware, anything to do with the unconscious, it can take a long time before you kind of get it. Like learning any skill, learning a language, learning to play an instrument, learning to drive a car, whatever it might be, you have to repeat over and over until there's that moment when it just kind of clicks and everything starts to fall into place. And I think this is no different to any other skill in that sense.